this is how you basically end up with socialist mindset and way of thinking. You end up with mob rule, and you end up with, it's easier to... All right, so Zoran Mamdani won. Big surprise. I mean, he was a socialist in New York City. So there's no big, shock factor there. The idea that, people supported, Republicans supported Cuomo over Silva was pretty baffling, in my opinion, because they are actually, why do I say that? It shouldn't be baffling, because that's the typical, there's somebody worse. There's somebody worse, and that's the way, I've been paying attention to politics since I was 8 years old, and that's been a huge, ever since I've been paying attention, that's the story. John McCain won the Republican primary. You have to support him, or do you want Obama to win? Well, he's a terrible candidate, so he loses. All right, and then you have Mitt Romney against Obama in 2012, same thing. And then you have Trump kind of come out of nowhere, kind of a dark horse. I haven't been a huge supporter of Trump in 2016. I supported him more in 2024 because of he basically came closer to me in politics rather than me coming closer to him. Now, my views kind of did change. I was more libertarian-esque. But anyways, it kind of is reminiscent of that typical logic that kind of goes along with good politicians, voting for bad politicians because there's somebody worse. So we end up with a Cuomo versus Mamdani fight when Mamdani still wins. So anyways, Zoran Mamdani, born in Uganda, moved to America and has been in the New York State Assembly since 2021. So he's new to politics. Not shocking. If you've watched the news at all, he's very communist-esque, right? So he has those reasonings, that typical communist, or the people who are heavy socialist. I want to refrain from using communist right now, just because it becomes a trope and becomes more of a ad hoc kind of, it loses its value. It becomes a platitude, because if anybody is not agreeing with me, they're a communist. But he's very close to that. Anyways, so he's a socialist, self-proclaimed Democrat socialist from New York. Why did he win? All right. Well, there's the demographic figure in New York City, particularly because they're 30% foreign-born. Right. So people move to this country, think it's a great place for opportunity, which it is, and then immediately want to make it something else. Right, because you're constantly comparing yourself to who you're around, not where you came from. Right, so you can start out with nothing, end up with $1,000, but somebody else has $10,000. Even billionaires do this, right? If you have $1 billion and you compare yourself, and your circle runs into being around 10 billionaire, $10 billion worth, then you feel poor next to them. So this is the typical, people come to America, end up a lot better off, and then immediately want to go back to where they came. This place stinks, but instead of going back, they want to make it more like, this is the way it should be. And so I have a huge problem with that kind of thought process. And in fact, I have a huge problem with universal, suffrage, for that matter, because of that. I don't think that people who hold dual citizenship should be able to vote. I'll get into a lot of different other factors beyond that eventually, but I was I went to Williamsburg this past month, and they kept on saying how restrictive the voting was, right? Only a man could vote, and you had to be a landowner, and you had to not have a mortgage. Well, voting is a huge responsibility, right? If you can't run your own life, if you can't be purely independent, thinking of, what your, thought process is. If you have somebody else in mind, basically the idea is that you'll vote. Your vote is compromised, and so they basically had a 10% suffrage. People who were, you had to be a landowner, you had to be man, you had to be, basically it ended up being one per household, and then you had to be like 21 or something like that. But they were passing this off as a oppressive and bad thing. Well, what you end up with is people want the authority without the responsibility. They want to be able to tell people what to do without being able to step back and control their own life. And so this is how you basically end up with socialist mindset and way of thinking. You end up with mob rule, and you end up with, it's easier to convince people to give themselves stuff by the point of a gun through the government, because they get a kind of a moral pass because it's somebody else, right? It's the government. And so it ends up being a moral pass for them.